Okay, well, the quizzes that we have today, this is our 6th week, but this is from last week of PowerPoint. So the Bobbitt stages are basically the 5 stages here. The principal 5 stages were princely state, kingly state, territorial state, state, nation, and then nation state, okay? I didn't ask for the next stage, I just asked for the first, because this is where it gets murky. This is the element of this. Then you go for the Bobbitt thing. Well, the next question is, what does Bobbitt say are the 6 institutional structures? We did this here. The 6 institutional structures of this is, particularly of the kingly state, right, is standing army, centralized bureaucracy, regulated taxation, diplomatic representation abroad, in other words, diplomacy, a diplomatic agent company, economic policies, and then a king as head of church. In other words, some kind of a national church, national religion. So that's where that. And then here, stating right onto that point, next question is, what does Bobbitt say are 2 metaphors, right? The metaphors, or here's the 2 metaphors. State acts as a network, right? The state acts as a network. And then the other metaphor is the state depends on society, the interconnection between state and society. And the last question is, what does Bobbitt say are the 2 factors of the interplay changes the constitutional order? And this is what he goes, and it's directly right here. Then the question is, what is the 2 changes of the constitutional order? If I remember correctly, it is, it's again, it is the oh God, if I remember correctly, it is the right up here between the in other words, the strategic and constitutional innovations, the interplay between these 2 things, strategic innovations and constitutional innovations. It's the whole structure of the argument. What is the 2 factors that is interplay that changes the order of the states? These are, remember, it's the hypothesis is that it's the interplay between strategic and constitutional innovations. And this is what deals with the constitutional order of the state. The innovations of the Constitution, constitutional innovations, there's different structures of the Constitution. And then the strategic innovations like military, warfare, the kinds of aspects of technology changes about how technology alters the strategy you engage in. So this is the 2 factors are the core hypothesis of his reading. And that's why I picked what I did here, because I think this was the key points. Everything you need to know about Bobbitt. The Bobbitt hypothesis about the idea that the Constitution, the state evolved because of this tension, this interconnection between the strategic innovations. That means strategic means like warfare, the conflict between states. In other words, interstate competition. So diplomacy, economy, military affairs, this strategic interplay and the changes that happen. I mean, like we talk about the innovation between, from longbow. I mean, the merge of longbow, which changed the war. I mean, if you went from the early Greco-Roman world, didn't have longbow. The Greek and Roman world, the world was spear and sword. Okay, spear and sword. In fact, therefore, organizational phalanx and that stuff. But what revolutionizes that? Longbow. Next revolution, gunpowder, cannon, artillery, rifle. Next innovation, things like the modernized artillery, cluster bomb and activities like this. Then next one, mechanized warfare, automobiles, technology, airplanes. Then atomic weapons. Okay? In other words, every innovation changes the political structure. Every type of innovation on the strategic, military, and that means economic, like policies that would mercantilism versus free trade, right? And then the next we go from that, that's the strategic. Now the constitutional order is the structure of the state itself. In other words, if you have what institutions of governmental structures, legislative bodies. Does the king do everything, or does the king create a parliament and delegates things to this? In other words, institutions and constitutional structures by which the state itself evolves, okay? And that what leads, the interplay of these two dynamics creates this move from each stage to the next stage, okay? And the problem here is this stage, at the nation state, what happens is, because of globalized economics, what happens? Why is the nation state in crisis now? Because the global economy has, in other words, well, it's kind of backlashed a little bit, but the nature of interstate cooperation economically has made nation states less powerful. In other words, globalization has created what? Globalized a class of people who owns global corporations, right? Who no longer have interests to the nation state. Their interests are transnational. Either region, sometimes they say regional or just global, okay? So therefore you have the weakening of the nation state. Actually, that's one of the readings I should put in here would have been Hannah Arendt's essay about why a nation-state crisis happens because of globalization, economics. Economics fundamentally will challenge the nature of economics. And we have to understand, economics, if it wasn't for mercantile and capitalist economics, in other words, trade and commerce, the nation state, the kings would not have been possible. The modern state would not have been possible. In other words, the modern state and its evolutionary trend interplays with economics. We'll talk about this later when we talk about the tools of politics, right? Economics is and trade is one of the fundamental tools of politics. And we can't escape from it. So this is the thrust of this. I don't want to go on too much more. I need to turn to this. I need to talk a little bit today about last week on founders, and I think we need to go over a little more just about this. The importance of founders are, and this is that line from it is a note in quoting where is it? It is the quote he quotes from Machiavelli Discourses. It's an earlier chapter, but it's in there. This is in chapter 1 at the end of it. He says, this should be taken as a general rule. This is from Machiavelli's Discourses. This is note 10 of the first chapter of Lucan's Lord book. It's on page 234 of the edition that we have in the PDF that you have to read. The footnote goes in, is footnote 10 in the back. It says, this should be taken as a general rule, that it is never or rarely happens that any republic or kingdom is ordered well from the beginning or reformed altogether anew outside its own orders unless it is ordered by one individual. Okay, he's saying, in other words, he makes the argument that there has to be, he has an argument against accidental organization. Okay, now this is a big question. The big question is intentional or accidental creation of political structures. Okay, in economics, there's a guy named Hayek, Friedrich von Hayek, who came up with the idea of spontaneous order. But spontaneous order is really a bad way to express it, because spontaneous order sounds like it's arbitrary, random. What he means by his concept of spontaneous order is emergent order. In other words, that in the nature of how things happen, an order will emerge. Okay? What appears to be accidental and chaotic has a pattern inherent. There are always, in any kind of organism or a set of behavior, there's always going to emerge a certain pattern, particularly regarding human action, human behavior, given that there's certain, given human nature and the ends of man and how man behaves, and by men I mean human beings, there's going to be what? There's going to be certain patterns that emerge. Certain trajectories and certain behavior structures that will tend to happen. Like families will form. In other words, human beings will form families. These families over time will produce generations. These generate people who share the same life forms community together. These communities together form mutual bonds which reinforce each other. In other words, you have certain fundamental trends and that these bodies will adapt to the environments that they're in. And that therefore the geography and the environments that they're in will shape whether they're successful or not. Because if they have resources, if they have means to achieve, in other words, to achieve their desires, fulfill their desires, those who have access to resources will be able to live better than those who don't, okay? So therefore you have these, certain patterns will emerge, certain trajectories, certain developments. All these things all together plays. Now the question is, what role does an individual play into this? And the argument is there, in other words, intention versus nature. In other words, the aggregation of nature. The argument has always been that it's always the kind of a lawgiver, the legislator, who's going to give shape to the various political connections. Now, this can happen not only at the beginning, and also can happen as a moment of crisis, or a moment of decay. Someone comes about, a political actor, or maybe a series of political actors. It could be a group of people who then what they do is they force a change to the system. They reformulate things. Okay? Now, therefore, this is, sometimes it's an individual, sometimes it's a group. Sometimes it is much larger. Okay? It can be, the idea of this group could be a rather, this is the problem of the elites, we call it. One of the most fundamental questions is, how do we understand the difference? Every political system, every thing has this dichotomy, not only between ruler and ruled, but also between the masses, or we call them the multitudes. Aristotle called them the multitudes. Ancient political science, we call them the multitudes, right? The people, okay, the larger group. The larger group, the population, the people, right? The masses. That's the modern word. We use the word, the modern social scientists like the word masses, the masses, right? And then the elites. The ancient Greeks and the Romans would say this is the nobles or the notables, okay? The few and the many, right? This is the classic division of all political life. The few versus the many. Okay? The elites, why do we have elites? We have elites primarily because, one, intelligence gap. In a dynamic group, there are going to be people who know how to do things, will have better knowledge or more ability than other people. In earlier primitive times, when we were very back in thousands of years ago, we had to survive. So the people who had the abilities to fight and to defend the rest of the people tended to be the leaders, right? This is how the emergence of monarchy began. That the effective warriors who were able to protect and secure the defense of the group, of the community, the tribe, would simply be deferred to because of their ability. Okay, their ability or their virtue. This is what virtue meant. The original conception of virtue meant the ability to do things correctly and well. That's what the Greek word for excellence is arete. Arete, virtue, we translate it often as. But this is meaning doing it well, doing an action well, doing it perfectly, doing it in the right way, the right time. And the way to think about this is the professional athlete. The professional athlete, when he's playing the game most beautifully, that is what virtue, this is how you should understand virtue. It is the actor who is acting in the action he's trying to do and doing that action perfectly. Doing it in the right way, the right time, and the right degree to the right end. This is how, therefore, to understand the original conception, the reason why the idea was the classical world argued that the virtuous should rule the people with virtue should rule those who lack it. Those who had knowledge should rule over those who lack knowledge. Okay? This is the origination of the concept of rule. This goes back to the first chapter of Politics 1, chapter 1. He says that actually chapter 2, chapter 2, saying that two bases of community. One is what? Parent-child. We come together, human beings come together for the sake of procreation, and therefore what happens is we want to leave people like our own, but then this requires us what? The rule of the parent. The one who knows versus the one who doesn't know, right? Then there is the master-slave relationship. Those who have, the master is the one who has knowledge of what is to be done, and the one who lacks knowledge, lacks foresight, lacks the ability to do it, should listen to the one who has foresight and knowledge to do it. This is the what it calls the natural order of relationships. Now, we take this and we go back to this concept. Okay, but does this mean? What does this mean? The ancient order, we have this idea that there was this people, these actors, these one people. But then what happens? It's not that we create new worlds all the time, right? What happens is that we have a pathway of a certain people that it has moved over time. Those institutions evolve and change happens. What happens over time, what a single man could do is no longer possible. Okay, just think about this. Why do we have elites? We have elites simply because of it's impossible to do everything. Matt, we talked about this. This is the thing of the problem of participation. Just imagine if you had 100 people, right? And those 100 people would have to decide everything the city does. Those 100 people would have to decide everything. What would happen? Well, you give 5 minutes. You just do the time situation. In other words, if you have complete participation, what's going to happen? Everyone gets equal participation. What ends up happening? Things take forever to make decisions and it becomes ineffective. So what's going to happen? Some people will self-select. Some people will self-select to be silent. Some people will self-select to open their mouths and dominate. So what will happen is there's human types. As social psychology tells us about the nature of human personalities, certain people are aggressive. Certain people have dominance traits. People are not dominant. Some people are agreeable. The big 5 traits, right? The big 5 traits and their subdivisions create different types of human behavior towards political action. People have like the so-called Dark Triad, Machiavellianisms, narcissism
and psychopathy.
Psychopathy, right? The Dark Triad. These are going to be leaders. These people are going to be your leaders. Why? Because they're going to be the ones. A vain person is going to be more willing to be extroverted. They're going to put themselves forward. Okay? But there's other types of leaders, okay? So therefore you have the Dark Triad, but then you have the Caring Triad. All these 3 multiple varieties of leadership creates what? People who put themselves forward. And in any kind of complex model, what's going to happen? As the bigger the population gets, what's going to happen? The smaller the percentage of people who's going to participate. In 100 people, you will probably get a situation of maybe 30 or 40. So 30% will probably be your leadership pool. But all of a sudden, what happens when that goes from 100 people to 20,000? Will it still be 30% of the population being the leaders are going to be the people acting in the system? No. It'll probably shrink to 120, something like that. You see what happens? There's an inverted relationship between the size or the percentage of those who act as the system will allow to participate fully and act as representative agents to it. So what happens? The nature of this is the famous iron law of oligarchy. The iron law of oligarchy, as any large networks of social relation grows, as the larger it grows, what's going to happen? An oligarchy will assert itself. In other words, the amount of people ruling the system will basically increasingly become more oligarchic. Because this is a complexity problem of representation, participation, and the interplay of people's actions. Now, this is why founders and elites are important. This is why the Lord's book talk about elites. Elites are always going to be present. You can't escape elites. Because why? It's any structured organization are going to produce leaders. If you don't have a leader, what happens? Nothing gets done. The question is, do you want a large, in other words, what is the most effective leadership model? Ideally, it should be small groups with leaders that are self-selected within them. And networks of, in other words, a situation where a few leaders up here and the mass like this is very much a non-effective model. There's no room for innovation, no room for development. It is the masses follow and the leaders make, in other words, the leaders make the decisions, but the chain of the distance between leaders and the followers, the people, are too distant. So therefore what you do is you create these levels of leadership. Why? You create these smaller communities of lower level leaders that does what? That has ability to innovate, the ability to make decisions, the ability, my God, you can see the effects of that right now, what's happening in Ukraine. Look how effectively the territorial militias have been in really slaughtering the Russian army. Why? I can tell you, the Russian army has the NCOs have no authority. Non-commissioned officers and these things have no authority. The big officers, in other words, lieutenants and captains have very little control. They're just people who whip the soldiers into line.
The Gerasimov Doctrine?
What?
It's called the Gerasimov Doctrine.
Well, it's even before that. This is the traditional doctrine of armies before the rise of the rise of bourgeoisie and the rise of this civil society.
And that's the reason why so many Russian generals died.
Oh yeah, because the generals have to go. The generals need to be out in the field, whipping the junior commanders, making sure giving orders so that the soldiers will obey them. Okay, will execute them. In other words, there's no low-level innovation. Corporals and sergeants don't get to make decisions. Only the big guy up here gets to make decisions. Okay. Whereas the territorial militias, what they're doing, they're letting localized leaders have, even localized leaders, regional leaders, are allowing subordinate leaders make the tactical decisions on their own. So the groups, these small groups, are doing what? They're having they pick their own leaders often. They will pick their own leaders, who then report to a regional leader. And what happens is that there's greater independence and greater decision of control. Okay, this is the two different styles of leadership in the different styles of elite. There's what we call a static hierarchy and a dynamic hierarchy. So there's multiple kinds of elites. The danger of elites is when they become stagnant. I mean, that's one of the big problems of this elites we have to talk about. The elites that become stagnant become problematic. But in founders, and what's so important about founders are the people who shape the institutions. They take the political dimension they're given, and they change the direction. Either they make it from nothing. Some people make it from nothing. Other people will take an existing system and redirecting it. And this is why the list that we had here from the Machiavelli were the famous ones. These people took, Moses took, the example of Moses. Moses took the Israelis who were in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. They took a people who already was subordinated and servile. And what does he do? He organizes them to leave Egypt, right? And over the time, over the desert, the journey shapes them into a nation, and then that becomes he reorganizes them into 12 tribes. He then organizes the political structure and the institutional structure of it. That becomes the political body of Israel. He doesn't go into that's the book of Joshua. That gives you account. Joshua is a person who replaces him, establishes Israel. But Moses forms it. In other words, Moses is the founder in that sense. He gives them the laws. Now you can say God gave the laws, 10 commandments, but then that's the difference between a Machiavellian way of reading it, a political way of reading the Bible, versus in other words, you look at the Bible, you don't really care, it's God or it's man. It doesn't make a difference. It doesn't matter. Laws were given. And Machiavelli is even hilarious about that. Even if God does do it, Moses is still the one God decides to act through. Okay, so without Moses doing it, it would not be done. Okay, in that sense. Cyrus, the great empire builder, he took a weak empire, the kingdom of the Medes, and created the Persia. Persia was a republic, a relative republic. The Medes were kind of a tyranny. And what does he do? He takes over the Republic of Persia, and then what does he do? He then conquers the Medes and all the other peoples. But reforms he changes the political order of that into a monarchy, even an autocracy. Okay. Romulus, the story of Romulus is the founder of Rome, who took random people and formed the city of Rome. Same thing with Theseus. Theseus is a great hero, the great hero who's rescued, goes to the Crete, and then what does he do? He forms the city of Athens. Now, Athens has two myths. The thesis, Athens was either, the myth of Athens always is that one of the undergods from Hades, I think it's Hespasus, lusted after Athena and attempted to rape her, but then what happens is she's able to resist him, but his sperm seed falls into the ground and people grow. And Athena felt sorry for them, and they became Athena's children. Okay, that is the myth of Athens. The other story of Athens' origin is the story of Theseus, who finds a whole bunch of ragabout nobodies, people running away from other places, and organizes them to form a city. Okay, these are the old stories of old legislatures, the ancient world. Now today we have different examples. The American Founding Fathers, right? We talk about this. The American Founding Fathers is a group of elites, group of localized different elites from of the colonies who went together to coordinate the resistance or trying to resist that then leads to rebellion against the crown, a revolution moment. Then what happens is that of these people, certain people show up, and there's a division of labor, right? There's a division of labor between Washington being appointed military commander, and then other factions. In other words, there was not one leader leading everything. Unlike what happens with Simon Bolivar. If you look at the examples of 30 years, basically, is it 20, 30 years, 40 years later, you have the revolution against the Spanish crown in South America. And Bolivar was trying to create the equal revolution of the North America in South America. He wanted to Gran Colombo, which was basically all the different states that were rebelling, Venezuela, which today Colombia, Brazil, all these states that were rebelling against both Portugal and Spain. And what happened? Well, it didn't go well. It failed. Another example of this is Bonaparte. The French Revolution, right? The French Revolution has this great revolutionary moment. They create a new revolution that spreads all through Europe. What happens? In France itself, it gets out of control because the infighting among the revolutionary leaders, the different sects, it gets so bad that after the terror happens within Paris itself, then what happens? But at the same time, the war is spreading all through Europe. Okay, and what happens is a nobody becomes a hero of the French Revolutionary Armies. He was just a corporal, but then he became his successful campaigns in the South and Italy led him to become such an important military leader that he came back to the crisis in Paris and did what? Took over. Okay? And established, and eventually took control of the revolution, then did what? Defeated basically in half of the revolution, defeat the Holy Roman Empire, destroys it. He initially destroys the Prussians, the German states, conquers Spain, right? And then he goes on his little crazy Russian expedition. Other than that, Napoleon's big tragedy was what? That he was, everyone thought everyone at the time at the revolution thought he was going to be a Washington. But the difference between a Washington and a Bonaparte is Washington does not become emperor. He gives up power. And if you understood Washington, who is his role model? His role model was the Roman example of Cincinnatus, who was elected dictator twice, but both times after he saved the republic, he gave up the title. Okay? In other words, you have to have, where Bonaparte's hero was Caesar. Okay, And actually, that's another thing. Think of Caesar. And actually, Caesar's a failure. Who's the real innovator who really fundamentally alters and stabilizes the Roman order and changes it from the republic to basically a kind of autocratic empire? It's Caesar's nephew, Octavius. And how does he do this? Well, by not making himself king. Not having anything associated with king. In fact, he uses the term principatus. Prince, the word prince is emerged as the term. Rex is a no-no word. So therefore, and we have some other things. We have Victor Emmanuel for Italy, modern Italy. Bismarck for Germany. The modern unification of Germany. We can argue that there's been 3 unifications of Germany, right? The first unification was the Bismarck, the Prussian-dominated Germany. Okay? But World War I destroys that one, right? And a lot of Germany is chopped up and lost. The whole Prussian dominant, and Prussia is kind of weakened by the partitioning of Germany, because you guys get the corridor, right? The Polish corridor led to a problem of Prussia being alienated from the heart of Prussia being alienated from the heart of Germany. Okay? And then next guy comes to unification of Germany and unifies even more so by uniting them in a way that even Bismarck didn't do. Come on. What is another German state that Bismarck did not include in the Germany? Come on. Austria. Bismarck left Austria alone because he left Austria-Hungary. He did not want he didn't want to, there's all these Germans in the Balkans. Did he want to unify all Germany, pan-Germanism? No. Bismarck said, famous line, that the whole of the Balkans is not worth the life of one Pomeranian grenadier. Pomerania is where? It's in, today it's kind of the Slovakia, isn't it? So therefore, you understand the second unification of Germany is the Third Reich, and that's the most. Ironically, this is the most German unification, because almost 99%, 98% of all the ethnic German populated areas were in the scope of Germany at the time. Okay, and then what happened? Two things. World War II destroys the Prussians. Hitler exterminates Prussia. And then and Stalin exterminates Hitler and Stalin exterminate Prussia. Hitler and Stalin made modern Poland. Because modern Poland is not completely different than the Second Republic. Because if you had the second, what two cities were in the Second Republic that are not in today's Poland?
Lvov and Vilnius.
Exactly. The four jewels of Poland, right? Two of the jewels of the Polish cities are no longer in Poland. Okay? So therefore, what happens is modern Poland is now, unlike the Second Republic, which was very diverse ethnically, modern Poland is 98% Polish? This is the most Polish Poland has ever been, historically, okay? You've been ethnically cleansed, successfully ethnically cleansed by Hitler and Stalin. Now that's not saying it nicely, but that's the reality of what happens sometimes. Germany too. Today's Germany, after 1992, is unified by who? Instead of it being dominated by the Prussians were exterminated. So in West Germany, what is the dominant political culture? If you look at West Germany, right, there's basically three parts of West Germany. The northern things, the Rhineland, and Bavaria. Which is the strongest of the three? The strongest, dominant, and economically?
Economically, it will be Rhineland. Rhineland, I think.
No.
Bavaria.
Bavaria. Because where is IG Farben? Where is the major pharmaceutical companies? They're all Bavaria. BMW, Volkswagen. Bavaria. We think of the Rhineland as being important, but that's not. It was Kump, but Kump was where? Prussia. Okay. You had airplane parts there, but then who was the biggest, wealthiest part of Germany? It's still go to Bavaria. You want to see wealth? You go to northern Germany. Looks poor. Rhineland's rich, but it's kind of moderated. Everything's moderated, everything's small. Go to Bavaria, it's like palaces and big everything's out of the world. And what's the difference? What is Bavaria? What Bavaria, Germany is what?
It's they have more autonomy than the rest of the.
Okay, but that's because of the federal system. But even more interesting, what is the dominant culture of Bavaria? Which is what? Catholic.
Yeah.
It's a Catholic, Southern Catholic Germany. It is completely, therefore, you see what happened? Prussian Germany was a Protestant work ethic Germany. Bavaria, Germany, it's good time party boys with Heiderlosen and hiking up mountains and things like that, right? And nature loving. Okay. In other words, you see the difference of Germany that has happened because of the structural changes. Modern Germany is not the same as old Germany. And we can see this the same thing as Lenin, how Lenin altered, we talk about modern cases like Kemal, Ataturk. How Lenin fundamentally changed the revolution, he changed it from a Russian empire to this is the thing about Lenin. Lenin didn't want a Russian empire. He wanted to change human beings. He thought he was going to create Soviet man. The sad part about that, did it work? No. Soviet man never worked, because what ultimately controlled who and what class controlled the Soviet Union? It was always Russia. The old Russian order. So even though the Soviet Union and the Soviet ideology sought to overcome the Russian Empire to create a federated system of Soviet men, of unified Soviet socialist republics, right? That all of them are going to be equal to each other. But what happened? No, Moscow, the Central Committee, controlled by the Russian ruling elites of the party, tended to dominate. Same thing happened in Yugoslavia. Come on. Yugoslavia, the unified Yugoslavia under Tito, it was supposed to be, again, like this, a federated republic of all the different people, Croatian, Bosnian, Serbian, Slovenian, right? And what happened? The Serbian dominated, okay? And then, therefore, this led to, anytime you have Serbian domination, what do you have next? Come on.
Ethnic cleansing.
Oh, no. Come on, think with this. When the French Revolution spread all over the world, right? Europe, right? The principle of the French Revolution was what? I'm going to pick on you. Excuse me. What is the logic of the French Revolution, in a sense? What was the fundamental logic of what happened with the French Revolution? It was overturning of what? What do they want to get rid of?
The rich people.
No. It's more this. They want to get rid of the aristocratic, the monarchy, the king, right? Remember, this is why Bobbitt's point that what happened. The people took over the state, right? What is the French Revolution? The people, the idea was popular sovereignty, that the people should rule, not the state, right? So that when the French Revolution overturned all these aristocratic states all through Europe, what happened? Did the people rule? Who ruled when the Spanish monarchy was overthrown, or when the German states were overthrown? Who tended to really govern things?
Napoleon family.
The French officers and French officials. So therefore, the People's Revolution became the rule of the French. This led to what? You were taught, the revolution taught you that this is supposed to be the people should be ruling. But the people ruling means nothing but the French ruling us. This leads to a backlash of what? That you want to be governed by yourself, right? You want to be governed by your own kind. Right of self-determination, right? The idea of the people has the right to popular sovereignty meant the right of the people to dominate and to make decisions. So, but wait a minute, what is the people? It's my people. I want to be governed by my people. Therefore, ethnic self-determination became the backlash. Nationalism emerged in reaction to the French Revolution. And this leads us to the desire of nations to be born. All of a sudden in Germany, what happened? Germany was this nation, but it was not political. It was all these states, right? All of a sudden, there needed to be a Germany. The longing for a united Germany. The longing for a united Italy. These are the two great innovations. In the middle of the 19th century, two nation states really emerge. In that sense. You have Germany under the Bismarck, under a Caesar. So it is technically the Kaiser, the Prussian Kaiser unifying Germany, and Mr. Bismarck had no stomach for Austria, and he liked the idea. He was against unification. But he saw it was inevitable. So if it's going to happen anyways, it better happen on our terms. Okay? In other words, this is a perfect example of a political actor saying, all the Germany wants unification of Germany. And if the Rhinelander Confederation gets their way, the Prussian monarchy is gone. And he's a Prussian monarchist. To save the Prussian monarchy, well, if unification is inevitable, Prussia better lead it, right? In other words, if something's inevitable, and if you don't like the inevitable, the thing with the people who want the inevitability thing to want it, you better take control over the future and direct it. That's what I mean by political founders. And that we can say the thing of Shevardnadze is a tragic case of Georgia, modern Georgia. Okay? We can say Khomeini is a scary case of really taking over modern changing of Iran totally and alterizing. He's very similar to Hitler in that sense. Charles de Gaulle is another example of a person who took who changed the fundamental character of democratic France. So, again, we're returning to today's a point about states, and we're refreshing it. We're going to talk about, in other words, the ancient world and the modern world, the political form is complete like this. That the ancient world is the polis civitas. This is the koinonia shape model. We live in the world of the state. Okay? The ancient world of the city and the modern world of the state. The difference is that these are localized, this was a more organic, localized, smaller structure, political structure. But the problem with smaller political structures is remember this is a point that Bobbitt talks about. And he kind of highlighted about the princely state. Why does the princely state conquer the older order, the orders of civic structures? Because the old civics, the cities, I don't want to use the word city-state, but the polis order, the city order, the political order of the civitas or the polis was just too small. It could join together in alliances with other cities, right, to kind of get strong, but alliances have a problem. Alliances are multi-headed monsters, okay? Whereas a unified, powerful, stronger state was able to conquer it. In other words, a more backwards place like Macedon, who was more backwards, but it was a unitary monarchy, was able to conquer the Greek states. And that, by creating the League, an empire, hegemonic empire, the League, the Hellenistic League, led by Philip and then his son later, Alexander, what does he do? He conquers Persia, conquers Egypt, Persia, unifies its rule. And then when he dies, all the things fall, the League falls into the control of one guy. The Ptolemies take over Egypt. The Assyrian side becomes another guy. Persia falls into another league. In other words, all the empire breaks into these larger empires. Then Rome comes about, and what does Rome do? Exterminates a lot of them, right? And unifies everything under itself. And then what happens to Rome? Rome gets too big, and what happens? Rome collapses. Because why? Mostly because it got too big, it became unresponsive, it became unwilling to, the elites or the ruling elites refused to, they only cared about themselves and didn't really care about the larger system. You couldn't maintain the army. The Roman army became an army of barbarians, mostly Germans and Gauls. Then what happened? When the waves of barbarians came, what happened to this wonderful thing? Everything fell apart. And then what happened? The evolution of modern European states. As these tribal leaders over time became the feudal, we talked about this, the rise of the nation, right? So therefore we see this development. The modern state emerges out of this collapse of the ancient orders. In other words, the Roman Empire collapses, and what happens? Tribes emerge. These larger tribal regional that share what? They have the French. You have the French. You have these elements of shared language, shared religion, shared cultural and national identity. And what happens is rulers emerge. And they slowly, basically local landlords who form alliances with other landlords to create dominance and then therefore kin groups. And then one bunch fights another bunch, and then one guy just says, I'm going to be the emperor of all the French, or king of the French. I'm going to be the king of England. And then what happens? If he's able to convince the other noblemen, the big families to be, come on, mafia dons. How does it work? If you need to be the boss of the family, you have to get the rest of the houses of the family to support you. That's the way aristocratic monarchies operated until the creation of dynastic ones. In other words, this leads us to, so the princely states emerge. The princely state is centralized. It is centralized, it's unitary, it follows the logic here. And here's another thing. There is this double-sidedness to the modern state. In other words, the modern state is always paired to society. Society and state are these twins, these kind of Siamese twins born at the same time. So, the society and the state are different aspects of the same phenomena. They're twins. They are the one thing. They're one. Therefore, like they're Siamese. There'd be like a Siamese twin where the head's different, right? Everything else they share. They have two. In other words, they have two distinct. One deals with they have different concerns. They have different functionality. The state society are fundamentally intertwined. The idea here is a free society. There needs to be limits to state authority. So the idea when there's no distinction between state and society at all, this tends to be kind of repressive and closed to total societies. But when there is there are degrees of separation where areas of political control cannot merge. This is where there's political freedom, political liberty. Okay, and this is why people like Karl Popper and other people will look at the ancient world and say, because the ancient world doesn't have this division between society and the polis. The koinonia, koinonia means a lot of things. There's a whole range. A family could be a koinonia, this community. A family could be a community, the koinonia, or a tribe could be koinonia. The question of koinonia is, which is the one that's complete? The idea of the one that's self-sufficient and sufficient in order to, a group of people in order to live well. And this was seen to be, the idea was this is the polis, this is the civitas. This was this autarkos, the Greek word, means self-sufficiency. The self-sufficient or perfect, in Latin, perfectus. This is the community that is able to, this is the form of community that is able to, that human beings can live well. Live as, fulfill their happiness, to achieve their happiness, okay? Now, the problem with this is that it's too small. And it won't survive in today's world of sharks, big empires. So therefore, there was a problem. You needed a new form. The world needed a new form. In order that freedom and human political life could survive, we needed a new form, and the new form became the state. The state and the polis are not the same thing. They're different. Conceptually, they're fundamentally different. There's a limit to the polis. The state has no limit. That's why it can evolve the way it does, by this evolution of it that can grow to a world state. In other words, there's nothing limiting the size of the state except the willingness of its members. Consent. If everyone consents, it will happen. So therefore, there are only arbitrary, accidental things that prevent unification of a world state. In other words, right now, why it doesn't happen is because people don't see themselves as the same. People don't see themselves as in other words, they don't share a large enough common interest. You know, the argument is that will change when? Come on. There's a joke about this. There will not be a world state until all of a sudden E.T. shows up, and then everyone, all the quarreling will have to stop in order to defend itself against E.T. In other words, the political reality has to change. Right now there's no other competition, so therefore, because there's no external threat that forces everyone to give up their giving up their. Because right now, the only utility is their own interest, right? There's no greater threat that forces them to cooperate. The second that there's a greater threat that forces them to cooperate, then they will cooperate. That's how nation states emerged. Because of these small little confederacies couldn't survive, so therefore they had to what? Confederate. And they exist only on a limited scale because why? Like Switzerland. Switzerland exists because it's in a mountain area. It's a pain in the ass to conquer. It has nothing worthwhile to conquer up there. So are you going to go bother conquering Switzerland? Really? You can bypass it. It's not worth the cost. So they can stay backwards. A bunch of islands in the Solomon Islands. They're too small. They can't grow any bigger. Again, they can be simply overwhelmed. And the only way they can stay free is by signing up to a bigger power to protect them, right? That's how this is. In other words, small states cannot on their own survive. They need to be protected by these smaller little city states like Singapore, example. It's able to survive only because it's strong enough, it's healthy enough, but it's so useful to China and other big powers, that no one will touch it. You see the logic of what the thing here? So therefore, this leads us to this problem. Today's topic is regimes, both modern, the idea of states and regimes. What is the regime? The regime is basically the Constitution. In other words, any political system, be it a city. Okay, the problem is the idea of the regime or the Constitution emerges actually from the political thought of the ancients, Aristotle's. The idea was that the city was going to be, in other words, the city was basically the collection of the households in a given community. And then what happened was the regime or the politeia was what? It was what ordered it. It was the ruling part, the part that in that city that had authority. Usually it was the armed part. It was the part that had arms and resources to do something. And therefore, this is the part that would rule. Today, the moderns translated the regime usually as constitution. They're translated as constitution. The politeia would be translated as the Constitution. What is the Constitution? It is the basic framework of a government. Remember we had the idea of a government is the ruling part of a state. There's the government of the state, and this that's often treated as Constitution. It's also sometimes translated as government. Okay, what is this? This is the form of the state. It was the form of the polis. What is in other words, the regime is the embodiment of form that is taken. And therefore, the Constitution has basically, we say, is the framework, has three elements. And this is the three elements. The functions of government, in other words, the powers and responsibilities that reside in the public rather than the private sphere. The structures of government, in other words, the institutions and mechanisms that constitutes the frame of government. And then last but not least, the procedures of government, the manner in which government carries out the powers and responsibilities entrusted to it. So it's the functions, the structures, and the procedures. This is what normally is what the Constitution was understood, and this is what the regime is understood as. Here is the next other aspect. The concept comes from the ancient Greek in that sense, has double meaning of both. It means both a general form or a system, and it has a particular, in other words, it has a general form or the system of things, the political system. See, that's what the Greek word would be politeia. The modern world we translated would be, one tradition would be constitution, the other one could be government. Another way we can translate it is government, political system, regime. Often it was termed constitution, but the problem with constitution is, as he says here, the term constitution can be seen as misleading, as constitutions are often too formally tied to written constitutions. Okay? Today we think of a constitution, what do we think? We think of the American Constitution, we think of the Polish Constitution. We think of it legalistically. And this is, again, this is more than legalistic. The idea of the Constitution is not only that it involves the legalistic aspect, right? The Constitution, the structures itself, but it also is the kind of way of, it expresses the view of justice, the way of life. The things we would say cultural aspects or political culture, right? The political culture is as much part of the regime as anything else. So not only the legal structure and the institutional structure, but also the political culture is an aspect of the regime. This is why the so-called Latin had a problem with it. The Latin for the politeia would be la res publica. But you understand, the res publica became the res republic, right? The res publica means literally the public thing, which echoes politeia. It would be ta politeia. Politeia would be could mean citizen, the rule of citizens, the rule of the political form or the political structure or the regime of citizens. Okay, this is why it was called both a general form of the system as well as a particular form of the system. And that's why Aristotle will be kind of interesting up to that point. We say that politeia or these things are basically is the who, how, and why of who governs, as well as the way they govern and the ends they govern, to which they govern, and the styles and forms they strive to obtain. You can get these. You can just take notes, but also you can get these PowerPoints are available if you need to go check them. They're on the class. Every class has. They're on the classroom. I upload them, so you can know them. But take notes because you know why, don't you? When you take notes, it goes into your mind better. When you handwrite things, it stays in your mind better. And in fact, that's the reason why you don't keyboard. Keyboard doesn't stay in your mind. That's the joke about that. When we type in notes, don't usually stay. Type notes are great for finding it, reading it later. But when you take notes by handwriting, it stays in your mind, long term. So what is the joke? What is the point here? Well, the politeia reflect the authoritative part of the political community. In other words, its ruling part. That's the Greek word. It would be politumata. This is about the ruling part. Some people translate the sovereign part, but that's wrong. That's a misleading construction. This governing body or ruling part is nonetheless a part of the whole. In other words, this is the difference between modern state. The modern state understands sovereignty, or this thing is there's no part governing it. What happens is the governing is only the classical understanding is a discrete system. And ironically, the ancient order, it makes more sense. Why? Because it doesn't engage in metaphysics. The metaphysics of the modern state is the idea of the unitary will, of the idea of contract. The social contract, which we get a general will by all the parties of this. In other words, therefore, that government is nothing more than a representative agent of the general will, of the body politic. Okay? This is the problem of the modern state. The modern state logic doesn't understand the government or the idea that there's a ruling element that is discrete on its own. It doesn't really understand it has a problem because what do you do with people who don't agree with you? See, the modern state is that since everyone agreed to the system and to the problem, right, the social contract, right? You've agreed to form it. So if you disagree to this, you're outside of the system. You broke the contract. So if you broke the contract, you are now outside and you get squashed. Then therefore you must be sick. In other words, who would disagree? Just the sick. Okay? The modern theory becomes repressive in this way. The modern theory becomes fundamentally repressive. The state assumes that there's a general will. What creates a general will? The social contract. The social contract creates a general will that therefore it is the will of all, and you should follow it. The political order should, and that the government is merely a representative agent that either follows it or fails to follow it. Okay? There's no room for the diverse opinions or disagreement in the body politic. Whereas if we look at political reality as we see it, we see there's often disputes. Because different parts, the city or the political community is not always going to be homogeneous. It could be divergent, and parts can diverge from their interests. Even a group that is homogeneous can have divergent interests. So therefore, you have to understand the nature of political life more, and this is why we're giving this. I'm giving you kind of the older political science. Because the problem is, the counter-teaching is that Hobbes is everything follows that his understanding of government representing the whole body politics as such, and not merely ruling part. Aristotle talks about this idea about the nature of political rule is that it's a part of the political community that acts on behalf of the whole, either for its own sake or for the common benefit. So thus the pluma tumida, we call the ruling part, thus is the structural way by which a given regime takes shape within a given political community. This is the older way of thinking about this. And I would argue this older way reflects reality more than the modern way. The modern way that understands everything as a unitary will creates a lot of problems, as I just highlighted, okay? So therefore, we have to look at this, and we'll see elements of part 4, and this is something I'll talk about later, go into this. This is basically the fundamental elements. He says the argument is the rich and the poor. This is always going to be the dominant conflict. The rich and the poor are always going to be at odds with each other. And Aristotle and the ancients argued the only way to stop this, if you have the rich and the poor, these are incompatible parts. The rich are always going to be dominating. The rich are always going to want their own way. The very wealthy don't know how to obey. They only know how to command. They only know and they're used to getting what they want. And they have no patience for not getting what they want. The poor are used to obeying. They lack. They have nothing. Because they have nothing, because they have nothing except their bodies, and they have no means to survive on their own. What happens? They lust after those who have. They lust and they want to take. And the only way they have no means of their own to survive. They require either being hired being hired for their labor, or they starve. They don't own land. They don't own the means to survive. They don't own resources to survive. They only have the poor. Literally, that's why the Greek word aporos. Poros, it means sustenance, the ability to sustain yourself. Aproos means without. Alpha primitive. Without the means to survive. Without the ability to have sustain themselves. And the wealthy is the means well. They have lots. Right? Now, the Greeks understood this, that you need the middle. And this is an American political scientist, Lipset, argued the same thing. The Lipset hypothesis is that stable democracies, stable governments require a healthy middle class. What is the middle class? He says the middling sort. This middling element is these people have the means to moderate the things. Now, this is the famous classical argument. The best city, Timaeus, the ambitious ones, the warriors. Then, in other words, the rule of the best city, the Kalapolos. This is from Aristotle's Politics, Book 8. Plato, sorry. This is from Plato's Republic, sorry. Timocracy was the rise of the honor lovers, the warriors that emerge who love honor too much, because they resent the father being the best father is the philosopher, these wise aristocrats. The problem with them is that the father doesn't get respect. And because of this, the son who loves honor resents the fact that the fathers get no respect, and eventually they love honor more, and therefore this is what leads to the cycle going to honor lovers. Then honor lovers turn into wealth lovers. Then what happens is wealth lovers turns into Democrats. Why? Because the wealth, the people, in other words, the people who don't have wealth. Usually, democracies happen because some wealthy person who doesn't have money, a son of the wealthy person, leads the revolution against the other oligarchs. Okay? And then what happens in democracy? A popular leader emerges who becomes a demigod and that brings who brings the society to tyranny. And then tyranny leads, that's why it's a cycle. Now this is Polybius, the Greek writer who wrote about Rome, gives the sequence. From monarchy to tyranny, to aristocracy, to oligarchy, to democracy, to holocracy, which means mob rule. In other words, this is the structures of how it turns into this. These were the classical cycles. Okay? And some people would argue that he switches this. That, in other words, oligarchy turns into tyranny, then tyranny turns into monarchy. And that's this. Tyranny often does turn into monarchy. And monarchy sometimes turn into tyranny. Because historically, that's what happens, historically. The evolutions of a monarch gets in power, a guy gets in power tyrannically. Tyranny just meant illegitimate entry of monarchy. Our modern understanding of tyranny means this kind of evil, mal rule for destructive. This is more tied with democracy and oligarchy, the extremes of oligarchy and the extremes of democracy. This is the classic Aristotelian typology of the constitutions. This is the classic thing of Book 3 he'll talk about, because in Book 3, it's which you were assigned to read, and what Lord talks about regimes, that the regimes are structured in a certain way. The two criteria, the number of rulers, one, few, many, right? This is called we would call this the quantitative claim of whose rules, one, few, and many. And the difference here is the qualitative claim is between whether the rule is for the sake of the common advantage or advantage of the rulers. And what he does here is this is how he divides the structures. Kingship, the rule of the one for the common advantage is kingship. The rule of the one for the advantage of the ruler is tyranny. The ruler of the few for aristocracy and oligarchy becomes this. And then democracy is the bad regime. And then what Aristotle does is he uses the same word he uses for the whole structure. The general word, regime, right, politeia, he then says, well, this, the regime, the politeia of the many for the common advantage is the politeia. He's like, an animal called animal. Okay? This is what he does here. This is why it's confusing. This is why, and the argument is because democracy, he is really hate, and this is why Polybius changes. Polybius calls this democracy and calls that mob rule. Aristotle here seems to accept at one level, he accepts Plato's critique of democracy. Because Plato thinks democracy is only mob rule. It's the rule of the ignorant, the rule of the unwise. We'll stop here. We'll talk about this a little bit next week or later. We'll talk about the modern the things. This is Machiavelli's typology is a little different. Each one of these authors have a separate typology, and we'll go into some of the modern typologies as we go off. Okay. So we have next week. We will talk about modern regimes and continue off from here. Okay. So we'll start next week with this. Okay? Again, because modern regimes all rely on the state. The classical regimes we'll talk about a little bit later are more diverse. Okay, take care.